Born the son of a king, the brother of a king, and a direct cousin to Queen Elizabeth II. Yet he spent his life not on a throne, but on his knees in the mud. While other royals clung to hollow titles in the gilded agony of exile, he traded a scepter for pruning shears and a palace for a tractor. He lived with dirt under his fingernails, selling fruit to neighbors who had no idea they were being served by one of Europe's highest-ranking royals. His name was Prince Tomislav of Yugoslavia. How did a man born to rule an empire come to find his true nobility not in a crown, but in a pair of muddy Wellington boots? Before the quiet of his orchard came the chaos of a kingdom falling apart. We must tear open the pages of history and return to a world that has vanished from our maps, to the turbulent, colorful, and dangerous stage of the kingdom of Yugoslavia between the wars. Tomislav was born on January 19, 1928, in Belgrade, the capital of the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which would soon be renamed Yugoslavia. His birth was not just a family event. It was a matter of state. He was born into the house of Karađorđević, a dynasty that differed sharply from the ancient ossified royal houses of Western Europe. The Windsors, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, they trace their lines back through centuries of palace intrigue and strategic marriages. The Karađorđević were different. They were a warrior dynasty, forged in the fire of revolution. They were men of the mountains, descendants of Karađorđe, the fierce leader of the first Serbian uprising against the Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century. Their legitimacy did not come from divine right, but from the sword and the support of the people. Tomislav was the second son. In the brutal arithmetic of hereditary monarchy, this position is often called the spare. It is a complex destiny. The firstborn, his brother Peter, was the heir apparent, the vessel for the nation's future, groomed from birth to rule, to be cautious, to be a symbol. Tomislav, however, was allowed a slightly wider berth. He was a boisterous, energetic child, a boy who preferred climbing trees to studying protocol. He roamed the manicured gardens of the Dedinje Palace complex, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Belgrade, breathing in the air of a country that was trying desperately to forge a single identity out of a patchwork of ethnicities and religions. The archival footage from this era shows a world of deceptive calm. We see the young princes in sailor suits, playing in the snow, or standing stiffly next to their formidable father. King Alexander I was a man of immense gravity. He was a soldier king, a veteran of the Balkan Wars and the First World War, a man who had marched across the Albanian mountains in the Great Retreat. He ruled with a firm hand, believing that only a strong central authority could hold his fragile, fractious kingdom together. To young Tomislav, he was a distant, awe-inspiring figure, a pillar of strength in a world that felt increasingly unstable. The first crack in Tomislav's world, the moment that would define the trauma of his generation, appeared when he was just 6 years old. The year was 1934. Europe was already beginning to tremble with the aftershocks of the Great War and the premonitions of the next one. Fascism was rising in Italy. Nazism was consolidating power in Germany. In this volatile climate, King Alexander sought to strengthen his alliances with France. On October 9, 1934, the king arrived in the port of Marseille aboard the Yugoslav destroyer Dubrovnik. It was meant to be a triumphant state visit. Crowds lined the streets cheering, but as the king's open-topped car moved slowly through the throng, a man stepped forward. Vlado Chernozemski, a mesmerizingly efficient assassin working for a confluence of separatist organizations, jumped onto the running board of the car and opened fire. The news traveled back to Belgrade with the speed of a lightning strike. For 6-year-old Tomislav, the concept of assassination was likely too abstract to grasp fully, but the reality of loss was immediate and crushing. In an instant, the pillar of his world had collapsed. His father was dead. His brother Peter, just 11 years old, was now King Peter II. The palace, once a place of childhood games, transformed overnight into a place of hushed whispers, black crape, and pervasive anxiety. A regency council was established, led by their cousin Prince Paul. The atmosphere in Dedinje became suffocating. The young King Peter and Prince Tomislav were now orphans of the state, surrounded by courtiers, generals, and politicians, all maneuvering for influence. They were children, living in a golden cage, watching as the storm clouds over Europe grew darker and heavier. Tomislav's education continued, but it was now tinged with the grim reality of his position. He was sent to England for schooling, a common practice for royalty, designed to build alliances and instill a Western outlook. He attended Sandroyd School in Wiltshire, a place of green fields and strict discipline, far removed from the boiling cauldron of Balkan politics. There, he learned to speak English with the immaculate accent that would later serve him so well in his second life as a farmer. He learned cricket, rugby, and the stoic, stiff upper lip ethos of the British upper class. But his heart remained in Belgrade. He returned to Yugoslavia for holidays, witnessing the creeping dread that was consuming his country. By 1941, Yugoslavia was surrounded. Hitler's Germany had annexed Austria and overrun France. Italy, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania had all fallen into the Axis orbit. Yugoslavia was the last neutral domino in the Balkans, a solitary island in a sea of fascism. Pressure mounted on the regent, Prince Paul, to sign the Tripartite Pact and align with the Axis powers. Paul, trying desperately to save his country from annihilation, signed the pact on March 25, 1941. The reaction in Belgrade was explosive. The Serbian people, with their history of defiance, poured into the streets. "Better the grave than a slave," they chanted. "Better war than the pact." On March 27th, a group of pro-British officers in the Yugoslav Air Force launched a coup d'etat. They overthrew the regency, declared the 17-year-old King Peter II of age, and repudiated the alliance with Hitler. In the palace, 13-year-old Tomislav watched his brother suddenly thrust into the center of a global hurricane. Crowds cheered beneath the palace windows, celebrating the young king. It was a moment of delirious patriotic intoxication. But across the border in Berlin, Adolf Hitler flew into a rage. He ordered Operation Punishment. Yugoslavia was to be destroyed, wiped from the map with merciless precision. The true end of Tomislav's world came at dawn on April 6, 1941. It was Orthodox Easter Sunday, a day that should have been filled with the ringing of church bells and the smell of incense. Instead, the dawn brought the Luftwaffe. Tomislav woke to the sound of the world ending. The roar of Stuka dive bombers and Heinkel bombers filled the sky above Belgrade. The ground shook violently as wave after wave of explosives pulverized the city center. The royal palace at Dedinje was a primary target. The walls trembled, glass shattered, and the air filled with the choking dust of pulverized masonry. What followed was a cinematic nightmare, a blur of panic and movement that would haunt Tomislav for the rest of his life. The protocols of monarchy dissolved in the face of high explosive terror. The royal family, King Peter, Queen Mother Maria, Tomislav, and their younger brother Andrei, were hurriedly packed into cars. There was no time for packing trunks, no time to save the family silver or the priceless icons. They took only what they could carry, a few changes of clothes, some documents, and a single suitcase each. They fled south, driving frantically towards the interior of the country, hoping to reach the perceived safety of the mountains. The roads were clogged with refugees, ox carts, and retreating soldiers. They drove through a country that was disintegrating before their eyes. The Croatian Ustaše were revolting in the north. The German Wehrmacht was slicing through the defenses with terrifying speed. The royal convoy snaked its way through the rugged terrain of Bosnia and into Montenegro. They were hunted. Italian fighter planes strafed the roads, forcing the royal party to dive into ditches and hide in the forests. The 13-year-old prince, who had been playing cricket in the polite fields of Wiltshire just months before, was now lying in the mud, listening to the whine of bullets and the screams of the dying. They eventually reached Nikšić, a small town with a remote airfield in the mountains of Montenegro. This was the extraction point. The British Royal Air Force had sent flying boats to rescue the king and his government. The scene at the airfield was one of chaos and heartbreak. Gold bullion from the National Reserve was being loaded onto planes. Officials were arguing over seats. Soldiers were weeping as they realized their king was leaving. Tomislav boarded the plane, a Sunderland flying boat. As the engines roared to life and the aircraft lumbered down the short runway, he pressed his face against the cold glass of the porthole. The plane lifted heavily into the air, banking over the harsh, beautiful limestone peaks of Montenegro. He looked down at the burning villages, the smoke rising in columns like black prayers. He saw the rivers and the valleys of the kingdom his father had died to build. He didn't know it then. How could he? But the boy looking out that window would not see those mountains again for half a century. As the plane pierced the cloud layer and turned south towards Greece and eventually Egypt, Tomislav ceased to be a prince in his own land. He became a number on a manifest, a political chess piece, a refugee. Yugoslavia, as he knew it, was gone. The flight took them first to Athens, then to Jerusalem, and finally to Cairo. From the heat and dust of Egypt, they were transported to London. But this was not a triumphant arrival. They landed in a Britain that was itself under siege, battered by the Blitz, rationing food, and fighting for its own survival. Wartime London was a strange gray purgatory for the exiled royals of Europe. The city was teeming with kings without kingdoms. The monarchs of Norway, the Netherlands, Greece, and Yugoslavia were all crowded into the same few hotels, primarily Claridge's, creating a surreal court in exile. They held meetings, issued proclamations, and maintained the stifling protocols of their stations, all while the bombs fell outside. For the teenage Tomislav, this environment was suffocating. He watched his brother, King Peter II, struggle under the impossible weight of his crown. Peter was young, inexperienced, and surrounded by quarreling politicians who were more interested in settling old scores than in saving their country. The British government, led by Churchill, initially supported Peter and his Chetnik resistance fighters, led by General Draža Mihailović. But as the war dragged on, the geopolitical winds shifted. Reports began to filter back of a new force in the Yugoslav mountains, the communist partisans led by Josip Broz Tito. Tomislav observed the painful disintegration of his brother. Peter was torn between his duty to his people and the ruthless pragmatism of great power politics. He was pressured by Churchill to abandon Mihailović and support Tito, a move that broke Peter's heart and alienated his most loyal supporters. Tomislav saw the toll this took, the drinking, the depression, the erratic behavior. He saw the hollowness of a title without land, the tragedy of a king who could only command ghosts. It was during these years, finishing his education at Oundle School and later entering Clare College, Cambridge, that a fundamental shift occurred in Tomislav's psyche. While the adults around him clung desperately to the past, waiting for a restoration that looked increasingly unlikely, Tomislav began to look at the world with a cold, hard realism. In 1945, the final blow landed. The war ended, but not for the Karađorđevićs. Tito's communists seized total power in Yugoslavia. They abolished the monarchy, stripped the royal family of their citizenship, and confiscated their property. Tomislav was declared an enemy of the state, a traitor, simply by virtue of his blood. He was 17 years old, stateless and penniless. The fairy tale was over. The king was not returning. The palace was now a museum or a government office. The crowds in Belgrade were cheering for Tito. Most young men in his position might have crumbled. Many did. The history of 20th century royalty is littered with the wreckage of princes who could not adapt, men who spent their lives in casinos and hotel bars, trading on their titles for free drinks, living in a perpetual state of bitter nostalgia. But Tomislav possessed a resilience that surprised everyone. He looked at the gray horizon of post-war Britain, at the bomb sites being cleared and the new world being built, and he made a decision. He would not be a professional exile. He would not be a museum piece. I realized, he would later say to a close friend, that I could either spend my life mourning what was lost, or I could build something that was mine. The kingdom was gone, but the land is always there. And so the prince turned his back on the phantom court at Claridge's. He left the suffocating atmosphere of intrigue and regret. He went to the countryside. He didn't go to hunt or to play polo. He went to learn. He enrolled in agricultural college. He wanted to understand the science of growth, the chemistry of soil, the biology of the apple. It was a shocking move. A prince of the blood, a descendant of Queen Victoria, getting his hands dirty. But for Tomislav, it was a return to his roots in a way no one understood. His ancestors, the original Karađorđevićs, had been pig farmers and traders before they were kings. They were men of the earth. By choosing the orchard, Tomislav wasn't stepping down. He was stepping back into the true lineage of his family. He started by working on a farm in Kent, the Garden of England. He didn't go there to own, but to learn. He needed to understand the deep, quiet satisfaction of planting a seed and watching it grow, a satisfaction that politics had never given him. But even as he pruned his trees and harvested his fruit, the shadow of Yugoslavia never truly left him. It was there in the silence of the evenings, in the letters he received from refugees, in the nightmares of the bombing that still woke him occasionally. He was a farmer, yes, but he was a farmer waiting for a harvest that would take 50 years to ripen. By the early 1950s, the map of Europe had calcified. An iron curtain had descended, cutting the continent in two with the brutality of a butcher's cleaver. To the east lay the Soviet sphere, a world of 5-year plans, secret police, and the gray monotony of totalitarianism. To the west lay a world trying to rebuild itself from the rubble, frantic with jazz, new construction, and the nervous energy of the Cold War. Somewhere in the rolling green hills of England, a man was crouched in the orchard, meticulously inspecting the root system of a young apple tree. To understand the sheer psychological magnitude of Prince Tomislav's transformation, we have to strip away the romanticism of the simple life and look at the cold reality. This was a man whose godfather was King George V of Great Britain. He was a man who, by rights of blood and history, should have been commanding tank divisions or opening parliaments. Instead, he was worrying about apple scab, woolly aphids, and the price of diesel. This wasn't a hobby. It wasn't a gentleman's farm, where a wealthy aristocrat points a cane at a field and tells a tenant to plow it. Tomislav was the labor. He had attended the Royal Agricultural College in Cirencester, not to network, but to survive. He absorbed the curriculum with a desperate intensity. He learned the chemistry of soil pH, the biology of grafting, and the economics of the wholesale market. He realized early on that in this new world, a title was a ghost, but a bushel of grade A conference pears was currency. Eventually, applying everything he had learned, he bought a property called Redlands in West Sussex. It was a derelict place that needed work, but amidst the weeds and the overgrown trees, Prince Tomislav began his second life. The locals in the village of Curdford watched the newcomer with typical British reserve. They saw a tall, powerful man who worked from dawn until dusk. They saw him driving a battered tractor, wrestling with rusted machinery, and hauling heavy crates of fruit onto the back of a truck. When he spoke to them at the local pub or the feed store, he was Tom. He discussed the weather, the eternal obsession of the British farmer, with a knowledge that could only come from watching the sky every morning for 20 years. There is a wonderful, almost cinematic irony in the anecdotes from this period. One story tells of a local woman who bought apples from him for years at a roadside stall. One day she saw a picture in a newspaper, a photo of a royal wedding in Germany, featuring a lineup of European nobility. There, standing next to the Duke of Edinburgh, was her apple seller. She reportedly drove to the farm the next day, newspaper in hand, and asked, "Tom, is this you?" He simply smiled, embarrassed, and said, "Yes, that was last weekend. Now, how are the Bramleys treating you?" This humility was his armor, but it was also a survival mechanism. While his brother, King Peter II, was suffocating under the weight of being a monarch without a throne, Tomislav was grounding himself in the tangible. Politics is abstract. It is a game of promises and betrayals. Farming is binary. You plant, you tend, you harvest. If you cheat the land cheats you. There's a profound honesty in agriculture that Tomislav found cleansing. It was the antidote to the poison of exile. In 1957, the farmer prince married. His bride was Princess Margarita of Baden. It was a match that thrilled the remaining royalists of Europe. Margarita was the niece of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. She was high nobility, deeply connected to the British and German royal houses. Their wedding was a flash of the old world, a glittering assembly of kings, queens, and princes gathering to celebrate. For a brief moment, the cameras flashed, the uniforms were donned, and the illusion of the pre-war order was restored. But the day after the wedding, the uniforms went back into the closet, and the Wellington boots came back out. Margarita, to her immense credit, did not shy away from the reality of their life. She moved to the farm. This was not a life of ladies-in-waiting and afternoon tea. It was a life of muddy floors, early mornings, and financial fragility. They raised their two children, Prince Nicholas and Princess Katerina, among the orchards. The children's upbringing was a bizarre, beautiful hybrid. On weekends, they might visit their Aunt Lilibet at Windsor Castle, playing in the royal nursery. On weekdays, they were expected to help with the harvest, learning the value of hard work and the cycle of the seasons. Tomislav was adamant. They were Karageorgievich, yes, but they were not to be helpless. They had to be useful. While Tomislav was building his orchard, his brother King Peter II was slowly disintegrating. This is the tragedy that ran parallel to Tomislav's quiet success. Peter had moved to the United States chasing schemes to regain his throne, surrounded by sycophants and spies. The stress was unimaginable. The king fell into a spiral of alcoholism and depression, his liver failing, along with his dreams. Tomislav watched this from afar with a breaking heart. He tried to intervene, tried to offer his brother the sanctuary of the farm, but Peter was too lost in the labyrinth of his own despair. This contrast defined the public perception of the family for decades. Peter was the tragic, doomed romantic. Tomislav was the stoic, reliable realist. This reliability made Tomislav a magnet for the Serbian diaspora. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, hundreds of thousands of Serbs were living in exile in Britain, America, Canada, and Australia. They were Chetniks who had fled the communists, intellectuals who had been purged, ordinary people who couldn't stomach Tito's regime. They were a people without a country, traumatized and fractured. They began to look to Tomislav, not as a king. He steadfastly refused to challenge his brothers or his nephew's claim to the throne, but as a patriarch, a vojd in the spiritual sense. On Sundays, the farm in West Sussex often transformed. Cars would pull up the gravel driveway, old Fords and Vauxhalls filled with Serbian families. They came to see the prince, and he would welcome them. He would wipe the grease from his hands, put on a clean jacket, and sit with them. They would drink plum brandy that he had distilled himself secretly in the barn, using the fruit that wasn't pretty enough to sell. He listened to their stories. He heard about the massacres they had witnessed, the families they had left behind, the property that had been stolen. He became a repository for the nation's grief. He didn't promise them an army. He didn't promise to invade Yugoslavia. He gave them something more important, dignity. He showed them that it was possible to be Serbian, to be proud, and to survive in a foreign land without losing one's soul. He became the quiet financier of the resistance. He didn't buy guns. He bought printing presses for émigré newspapers. He paid for the restoration of Serbian Orthodox churches in Birmingham and London. He funded scholarships for the children of refugees. He understood that the battle against communism wasn't just about territory, it was about memory. If the culture survived, the nation survived. But there was a deep, unspoken pain in him. He was the anti-pretender. He refused to play the game of the government in exile. He famously said, "I will not impose myself. The people must want it." He saw the futility of issuing royal decrees from a London townhouse while Tito was hosting world leaders in Belgrade. He knew that if the monarchy were ever to return, it had to be organic. It had to come from the soil up, not from the top down. His marriage to Margarita eventually succumbed to the pressures of this strange bifurcated life. They divorced in 1981. It was a sad, quiet end to a partnership that had weathered so much. But Tomislav did not remain alone. He found love again with Linda Bonney, a commoner. This marriage was another statement. He wasn't marrying for dynastic alliance. He was marrying for companionship. He was moving further away from the rigid expectations of the Almanac de Gotha and closer to the man he had become, Tom, the farmer. As the 1980s wore on, the world began to shift again. The tectonic plates of geopolitics were grinding. Tito died in 1980. The glue that held Yugoslavia together, the force of his personality and his ruthless secret police, began to dissolve. Inflation soared. Ethnic tensions, frozen in the deep freeze of totalitarianism for 40 years, began to thaw and stink. In his farmhouse, Tomislav watched the news with a growing sense of foreboding and hope. He saw the rise of Slobodan Milosevic. He saw the nationalist rhetoric heating up. He received letters from inside Serbia, letters that were no longer smuggled out in secret, but sent openly. The fear was fading. The people were waking up, but they were waking up to a nightmare. Yugoslavia was cracking. Slovenia and Croatia were pulling away. The rhetoric in Belgrade was becoming apocalyptic. Tomislav knew his time was coming. He felt it in his bones the way an old farmer feels a storm coming before the first drop of rain falls. He started to prepare. He began to wind down his operations at the farm. He spent more time on the phone with the church leaders in Belgrade. He was testing the waters. Could he go back? Would they arrest him? Would they shoot him? Or perhaps worse, would they ignore him? He was 63 years old. His knees ached in the damp English winter. He had spent 51 years in exile. He had lived longer in England than he had in the country of his birth. He drank tea with milk. He drove on the left side of the road. He dreamed in English, but in his heart he was still the boy on the airfield in Nikšić, watching the mountains disappear. He had made a promise to himself, a silent vow taken in the misery of 1941. I will go home. In late 1991, the call finally came. It wasn't an official invitation from the government. It was a message from the Serbian Orthodox Church and from a group of intellectuals in Belgrade. The people are asking for you, they said, not for the king, for the prince who never forgot them. It was the most terrifying moment of his life. More terrifying than the bombs, more terrifying than the exile. To return was to risk everything. The Yugoslavia he remembered was a memory. The reality was a powder keg. He packed his bags. He didn't pack a crown. He didn't pack a uniform. He packed warm clothes, his medicines, and a few photos of the orchard he was leaving behind. He walked out of the farmhouse door, leaving the keys on the table. He looked at his trees one last time, the rows of silent, gnarled witnesses to his years of waiting. He had grafted them, pruned them, fed them. They were his children, but a different harvest was waiting for him now. He got into the car for the drive to Heathrow Airport. He was driving towards a war zone. He was driving towards a country that was tearing itself apart. He was driving towards the past. The flight from London to Belgrade in late 1991 was more than a journey across a continent. It was a journey across time. As the plane began its descent over the Pannonian Plain, Prince Tomislav pressed his forehead against the cool plastic of the window, just as he had done as a terrified 13-year-old boy in the belly of that RAF bomber 50 years prior. But this time, the landscape below him wasn't burning, at least not here, not yet. The Serbia he was returning to was a pariah. The United Nations sanctions were tightening their grip like a noose. The country was isolated, painted by the Western media as the villain of the Balkans. The fuel was scarce, the currency was beginning its hyperinflationary death spiral, and the air was thick with the static electricity of impending violence. To leave the stability of West Sussex with its fat dairy cows and predictable rains, for this cauldron of chaos was an act that defied all logic. When the wheels touched the tarmac at Sirchin Airport, a physical jolt went through the prince's frame. It was the shock of reconnection. For half a century, home had been a theoretical concept, a memory preserved in amber or a word whispered in prayers. Now suddenly, brutally, it was concrete beneath his feet. He stepped out of the plane, not into a royal reception, but into a gray biting wind. He wore a sensible raincoat and carried his own bag. He looked less like a scion of the Karađorđević dynasty, and more like a retired professor returning from a conference. But the moment he cleared customs, the anonymity vanished. Word had spread. It hadn't been on the state-run television, which was controlled by Milosevic socialists, but it had traveled through the grapevine of the church and the monarchist underground. The prince is coming. The scene in the arrivals hall was chaotic, raw, and deeply un-British. There were no red carpets, no military bands playing anthems. Instead, there was a crush of humanity. Old men in Chetnik hats, weeping openly, women holding up faded black and white photographs of his father, King Alexander. Young men who had grown up under communism, looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and desperation. They surged forward to touch him, to kiss his hand, to verify that he was real. For 50 years, the communists had taught them that the royal family were thieves who had fled with bags of gold. Yet here was this tall, weathered man with the hands of a worker and the eyes of their grandfathers. He didn't recoil from the crowd. He didn't look for security guards. He waded into them. He spoke to them, not in the archaic, frozen Serbian of the 1940s, but in a voice that cracked with genuine emotion. "I am not here to rule," he told a reporter who managed to shove a microphone in his face. "I am here to help. I am here to be with you." He didn't stay in Belgrade. The capital was too loud, too political, too full of the ghosts of the palace he could no longer enter. His destination was deeper in the soul of the country. He got into a car and gave the driver a single instruction: Oplenac. The drive south through the Šumadija region was a revelation. This was the heartland of Serbia, the terrain of his ancestors. He saw the rolling hills, the plum orchards, the vineyards, but he saw them with the eyes of a Sussex farmer now. He saw the neglect. He saw orchards that hadn't been pruned properly in decades, fields that were crying out for rotation, villages that looked tired and gray. The communism that had industrialized the cities had left the countryside to wither. As the car wound its way up the hill of Oplenac above the town of Topola, the white marble of St. George's Church came into view. It is a breathtaking structure, a fusion of Byzantine and Serbian medieval styles, capped with white domes that gleam against the sky. It is the spiritual anchor of the dynasty, the mausoleum where the Karađorđević kings are buried. But as Tomislav stepped out of the car, the shine of the marble couldn't hide the decay. The complex had been treated by the communist regime as a museum of feudalism. It was cold, dusty, and soulless. The royal vineyards, once the envy of Europe, were overgrown tangles of weeds and diseased vines. The king's villa, the modest cottage where his father had loved to stay, was locked up and smelling of damp. Tomislav walked to the heavy doors of the church. He pushed them open and stepped into the cool, silent interior. The walls were covered in millions of mosaic tiles, replicas of the greatest medieval frescoes of Serbia. The gold leaf still shimmered, but the air was stale. He walked down the stairs to the crypt. It was darker there. He walked past the tombs of his ancestors until he reached the slab of white onyx that marked the resting place of his father, King Alexander I. He knelt. For the first time in 57 years, the son was reunited with the father. The last time he had seen him was as a 6-year-old boy, waving goodbye before that fatal trip to Marseille. Now Tomislav was an old man, older than his father had ever lived to be. He placed his hand on the cold stone. No cameras were allowed in that moment. What was said or prayed or wept in that crypt remains between the prince and his God. But when he emerged back into the sunlight of Šumadija, his face was set. The hesitation was gone. "I'm staying," he said to the small group of priests and locals who had gathered outside. "This is where I belong." He did not ask for the restitution of the White Palace in Belgrade. He didn't demand a government stipend. He asked for the keys to the king's villa, the small thatched roof cottage on the Oplenac estate. It was little more than a gamekeeper's lodge compared to the royal residences of Europe. It had no central heating. The plumbing was archaic, and the roof leaked. "It's perfect," Tomislav said. He moved in immediately, and just as he had done in Kent in 1950, he went to work. The transformation was physical and immediate. The Prince of Yugoslavia put on his work clothes. He found a pair of shears. He walked into the neglected vineyards of his grandfather and started pruning. The locals were stunned. They had expected a monarch who would sit on a velvet chair and receive delegations. Instead, they saw a man in muddy boots wrestling with brambles. They saw him climbing ladders to fix the roof of the cottage. They saw him driving an old Zastava car down to the market in Topola to buy bread and cheese. Slowly, the ice of fear broke. The people of Topola realized that this wasn't a political stunt. "He works like us," they whispered in the kafanas. "He knows the land." But while Tomislav was finding a fragile peace in his garden, the country around him was descending into hell. 1992 was the year the wars in Bosnia and Croatia exploded in earnest. The news was a daily barrage of horror: sieges, massacres, ethnic cleansing, refugees streaming across borders in tractor trailers. Tomislav could have stayed on his hill. He could have tended his vines and ignored the firestorm, claiming he was too old, too removed. But the quiet prince revealed a core of steel that stunned observers. He refused to be a bystander. He began to travel. He didn't travel to the diplomatic salons of Geneva or New York. He traveled to the front lines. In an old battered Jeep, often without any security detail other than a priest or a driver, the 64-year-old prince drove into the war zones. He went to the Serbian enclaves in Bosnia. He visited the field hospitals where young men, boys really, the same age he was when he fled in 1941, lay screaming with shrapnel wounds. These soldiers had been raised on Marxist textbooks that called his family bloodsuckers. Yet when they looked up from their stretchers and saw this tall, dignified man holding their hands, wiping their brows, bringing them antibiotics that he had paid for with his own dwindling savings, the ideology evaporated. "My son," he would say, his voice trembling, "you are not alone." He became a logistical lifeline. He used his British passport and his royal connections to bypass the sanctions. He badgered humanitarian agencies in London. He called in favors from cousins in European royal houses: send insulin, send bandages, send anesthesia. He turned the king's villa into a warehouse for aid. The living room, where kings used to drink tea, was stacked high with boxes of sterile gauze and surgical kits. There is a haunting story from the winter of 1993. Tomislav was visiting a remote village in the Republika Srpska, cut off by snow and sniper fire. The electricity had been out for weeks. He arrived with a convoy of aid. An old woman wrapped in layers of ragged wool approached him. She didn't know who he was. She just saw a kind face. She offered him an apple, shriveled, small, preserved from the autumn harvest. It was likely the only fresh food she had left. Tomislav took the apple. He looked at it with the eye of an expert pomologist. He saw the bruising, the signs of a hard winter. He took a bite, tears streaming down his face, and told her it was the best apple he had ever tasted. He was bridging a chasm that no politician could cross. Milosevic sat in his palace in Belgrade, moving armies on a map like pieces in a game of Risk. The opposition leaders argued in cafes about constitutions and borders. Tomislav was in the mud, in the blood, in the cold. He was careful, however, to walk a razor-thin political line. He knew that if he openly challenged the Milosevic regime, he would be expelled or accidentally killed. He adopted a stance of radical neutrality. He would support the people, not the government, and not the warlords. When ultra-nationalist paramilitaries tried to claim him as their mascot, he rebuffed them. When politicians tried to use him for photo ops, he was suddenly busy in the vineyard. "I am the prince of all," he said. "I do not have the luxury of sides." But the strain was immense. He was an old man, pushing himself through snowstorms and war zones, sleeping in unheated barracks, eating military rations. The trauma of the people became his trauma. He was absorbing the pain of a nation that was committing suicide. Back at Oplenac, in the quiet moments between trips, he focused obsessively on the restoration of the estate. It was his therapy. He believed that if he could fix the church, if he could make the vineyards green again, perhaps the country could be healed too. It was a sympathetic magic. He brought in experts to clean the mosaics. He replanted the vines with the correct varietals. He started making the royal wine again, labeling the bottles himself. He wanted to show the Serbs that they were not just a nation of warriors and victims. They were creators. They were builders. Look, his actions seemed to say, we can make something beautiful here, even in the middle of this ugliness. But the body can only endure so much. The years of exile, the hard labor on the English farm, and now the brutal stress of the war began to take their toll. He started to feel a deep, grinding fatigue. He ignored it, of course. There were still refugees to help. There were still vines to prune. He didn't know it yet, but the final battle of his life was approaching. It wouldn't be fought against a communist dictator or a foreign army. It would be fought within his own cells. By the late 1990s, the physical toll of Prince Tomislav's return was becoming impossible to hide. The man who had once hauled crates of apples onto trucks in the damp English dawn, the man whose physical strength was a source of local legend in West Sussex, was beginning to wither. It started insidiously, a persistent fatigue that sleep couldn't cure, a dull ache in the bones that no amount of work could sweat out. At first he dismissed it. He was a farmer, and farmers are conditioned to ignore pain. There is always a fence to fix, a harvest to bring in, a war to worry about, but the body keeps a tally that the will cannot override. The diagnosis, when it came, was grim. It was a severe aggressive illness. In the clean, sterile offices of Western medicine, the solution would have been immediate: aggressive chemotherapy, surgery, palliative care, in a private clinic in London or Zurich. His relatives in the British royal family, his friends in the aristocracy, his doctors, they all urged him to leave. Come back, they said, come back to the comfort of the West. The hospitals in Serbia are broken. There is no medicine. There is no heat. You will die in misery. This was the final test of his character. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for Tomislav to board a plane and return to the soft green embrace of England. He could have spent his final days in a comfortable bed, surrounded by nurses who spoke in hushed tones, watching the cricket on television. He refused. His response to the doctors was curt and absolute. I spent 50 years trying to return to this soil, he reportedly said. I did not come home just to leave when it gets dark. If I am to die, I will die here. He stayed in the drafty king's villa at Oplenac. The winter of 1998 was harsh. The sanctions meant that heating fuel was a luxury. The prince, wrapped in wool blankets, watched the snow fall on the graves of his ancestors. He was in pain, significant pain, but he found a strange solace in the suffering. He was sharing the fate of his people. He wasn't floating above them in a royal bubble. He was freezing with them. But history had one final cruel irony in store for him, one last circle to close. In March 1999, the sirens wailed again. The negotiations over Kosovo had failed. NATO launched Operation Allied Force. The might of the Western Alliance, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, turned its sights on Yugoslavia. For Tomislav, this was a psychological torture that is difficult to comprehend. He was a British citizen. He had served the British crown. His cousin was the Queen of England. He loved Britain. It had given him shelter when the world had turned its back on him. And yet now, the planes bearing the roundels of the Royal Air Force were flying over his head, dropping bombs on the country he had returned to save. On the night the bombing began, the air raid sirens cut through the silence of Topola. The sound was a visceral trigger. It instantly transported the 71-year-old man back to that bedroom in Belgrade in April 1941. The sound of the engines, the distant thud of anti-aircraft fire, the trembling of the earth. It was the nightmare of his childhood, returning to claim his old age. His staff tried to move him to a shelter. He refused. He was too weak to walk down the stairs and too proud to be carried. He lay in his bed in the king's villa. As the detonations rocked the ground, striking radar installations, bridges, and factories across Serbia, the windows of the villa rattled in their frames. Witnesses say he lay there with his eyes closed, tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks. He wasn't weeping for himself. He was weeping for the tragic absurdity of it all. He was the living embodiment of the alliance between the Serbs and the West, a prince of both worlds. And now those two worlds were tearing each other apart while he lay dying in the middle. During the 78 days of bombing, Tomislav's condition deteriorated rapidly. The stress accelerated his decline. Yet even then, he remained the quiet bridge. He received visits from Russian diplomats, from Greek officials, from Serbian opposition leaders. He couldn't speak much, his breath coming in shallow gasps, but his presence was a statement. I am still here. When the bombing ended in June 1999, the silence returned to Oplenac. But it was the silence of a graveyard. The country was broken, the infrastructure smashed, the mood apocalyptic. Tomislav knew he would not see another spring. The final year of his life, late 1999 into 2000, was a slow fade. He became bedridden. But a remarkable thing began to happen. The king's villa became a pilgrimage site. They came from all over, not just the politicians and the bishops, but the farmers, the men with whom he had discussed apple grafts, the refugees to whom he had given blankets. They came to the gates of Oplenac to leave flowers, to light candles, to ask the staff how our Tom was doing. He insisted on his better days on being wheeled out to the terrace. He wanted to see the vineyards. He had replanted them, but he knew he would never drink the wine from the vintage that was maturing on the vines. That is the ultimate act of a farmer, to plant a tree whose shade you will never sit in, to tend a vine whose fruit you will never taste. It is an act of faith in the future. In the summer of 2000, the end drew near. The Serbian Orthodox Church, which had always been his staunchest ally, surrounded him with prayer. Patriarch Pavle, a living saint in the eyes of the people, visited him. They spoke of spiritual things, of forgiveness, of the burden of history. Tomislav had one final request. He did not want a state funeral. He did not want politicians making speeches over his coffin to score points. He wanted to be buried with his family. He wanted to take his place in the line of succession that death had interrupted. On July 12, 2000, on the feast day of Saints Peter and Paul, a holy day of immense significance in the Orthodox calendar, Prince Tomislav took his final breath. He was 72 years old. He died in the king's villa, just a few hundred yards from the crypt where his father lay. He had closed the circle. The boy who had fled in the night had returned to die in the light of his own home. The news of his death moved through Serbia like a low-frequency wave, a somber, heavy vibration. The state-controlled media gave it little attention, still wary of the monarchy's influence. But the people knew. The funeral, held a few days later, was a moment of suspended time. Serbia was on the brink of another revolution, but for one day the politics stopped. Thousands of people flooded the complex at Oplenac. It was a sea of black. There were old royalist officers in moth-eaten uniforms standing next to young students in denim. There were peasants from the Shumadija villages holding sprigs of basil, and city intellectuals holding quiet dignity. The coffin, draped in the flag of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, was carried into St. George's Church. The liturgy was ancient. The the choir's voices rising into the mosaic-covered dome, singing the Wiecznaja Pamjat, memory eternal. They carried him down into the crypt. It was cool and silent, the white marble glowing in the candlelight. They lowered him into the earth, next to his brother King Peter II and his father King Alexander. As the stone slab was slid into place, sealing him into history, a profound realization settled over the crowd. Tomislav was the only member of his generation, the tragic generation of the 1920s, to be buried in Serbian soil at the time of his death. The others were scattered in cemeteries in London, Libertyville, Paris, and Lausanne. He alone had made it back. The farm in Sussex was sold. The tractor was likely auctioned off. The apple trees he planted in England continued to bear fruit for strangers. But in Oplenac, the roots he had put down in his final years were of a different kind. He left behind no vast fortune. He left behind no political party. He left behind a restored church, a replanted vineyard, and a restored dignity to a name that had been dragged through the mud for half a century. But the story of Prince Tomislav is not just a biography of a man. It is a mirror held up to the 20th century. And as we step back to look at the full picture of his life, the lessons he left us become clearer, sharper, and more necessary than ever. There's a cruel, almost literary irony in the timing of Prince Tomislav's death. He passed away on July 12, 2000. Less than 3 months later, on October 5, 2000, the regime of Slobodan Milošević finally collapsed. The bulldozers charged the state television building, the tear gas cleared from the streets of Belgrade, and the dark cloud that had hung over Serbia for a decade finally broke. Tomislav, the man who had waited 50 years for this moment, missed it by 12 weeks. He was the Moses figure of the Karađorđević dynasty. He had led the spiritual return. He had crossed the desert of exile. He had reestablished the presence of the crown on Serbian soil, but he did not live to see the full liberation. He died while the old world was still gasping its last breath, never getting to inhale the first lungful of the new democracy. But in the years that followed his burial in the crypt of Oplenac, it became clear that Tomislav was not just a footnote in the family history. He was the anchor. Without his quiet, stubborn presence in the 1990s, the restoration of the dynasty's dignity might never have happened. When the rest of the royal family finally returned to live in Serbia after the October Revolution, led by his nephew, Crown Prince Alexander, they were stepping onto a path that Tomislav had cleared for them. He had hacked through the thicket of communist propaganda with nothing but a pair of gardening shears and a gentle demeanor. He had softened the ground. Because of Tom, the Serbian people no longer saw the royals as distant foreign caricatures. They saw them as human beings who could suffer, work, and die just like anyone else. The most profound validation of Tomislav's life choice came 13 years after his death, in May 2013. For decades, the Karađorđević family had been scattered in death as they were in life. King Peter II was buried in a monastery in Libertyville, Illinois, the only European monarch buried on American soil. His mother, Queen Maria, was in the royal burial ground at Frogmore in Windsor, near her British relatives. Queen Alexandra was in Athens. They were a dynasty of ghosts haunting foreign graveyards. But in 2013, the new Serbian government finally reconciled with its history, authorized a state funeral to repatriate them all. It was a massive, solemn undertaking. The remains were exhumed from 3 different countries and flown to Belgrade. On May 26, 2013, a hearse carrying the coffin of King Peter II wound its way up the familiar hill of Oplenac. It was followed by the coffins of his wife and mother. Tens of thousands of people lined the route. The church bells, the same ones that had failed to ring during the bombing of 1941, tolled across the valley. Inside the crypt, Prince Tomislav was waiting. He had been there alone for 13 years, holding the ground. Now his brother, the tragic king, who had died of a broken heart in exile, was coming home to join him. The family that had been blown apart by the Luftwaffe in April 1941 was finally reassembling underground. It is difficult to overstate the emotional resonance of this moment for those who knew the history. The loud king, who had spent his life in headlines and political storms, was finally coming to rest beside the quiet prince, the farmer who had simply gone home early to prepare the house. Today, if you visit the Oplenac complex, the legacy of Tomislav is not found in statues or plaques. It is found in the living landscape. The vineyards he replanted are thriving. The royal winery produces excellent Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir. The wine labels often bear the crest of the dynasty, but the vines themselves, the gnarled woody roots that dig deep into the Humanitarian clay, owe their survival to the hands of the prince, who learned his craft in the wet earth of West Sussex. There is a specific atmosphere at Oplenac that is distinct from other royal sites in Europe. Versailles is a monument to power. Oplenac is a monument to survival. When you walk through the quiet woods surrounding the church, you are walking through Tomislav's final victory. He proved that a connection to the land is stronger than any political decree. Governments can confiscate palaces, they can burn passports, and they can rewrite history books, but they cannot stop a man from planting a tree. The contrast between Tomislav and the other displaced royals of the 20th century remains stark. Consider the Romanovs, slaughtered in a cellar. Consider the Italian royals, banned from setting foot in Italy for decades, living in scandalous exile. Consider the Greek royal family perpetually drifting. Tomislav charted a different course. He didn't sue for his property. He restored it for the public. He didn't demand a salary. He lived on a pension. He didn't ask to be treated as a highness. He asked to be treated as a neighbor. In doing so, he redefined what it means to be noble in the modern age. We often confuse nobility with hierarchy, assuming it has to do with who bows to whom. Tomislav showed that true nobility is the capacity to endure loss without bitterness, and the willingness to serve people who have nothing left to give you but their grief. He was a bridge between the Anglo-Saxon pragmatism he learned in England and the Slavic soul he was born with. He combined the stiff upper lip with the heart. He brought the work ethic of a British farmer to the tragedy of the Balkans. As we look back on his life, we see a man who stripped away the layers of identity that society told him were important. He started as a prince, became a refugee, then a farmer, then a humanitarian, and finally simply a man dying in his childhood home. It was a process of shedding. He shed the weight of the crown to find the weight of the earth. In a century obsessed with accumulation, of power, of wealth, of fame, Tomislav's life was a masterpiece of subtraction. He let go of the throne. He let go of the pretension. He let go of the anger. And in the end, because he had empty hands, he was the only one who could hold on to the one thing that mattered: his home. Ultimately, the life of Prince Tomislav forces us to reconsider the definition of a successful life. If you view history through the lens of titles and territories, Tomislav was a failure. He never wore the crown. He never commanded armies in victory. He spent the prime of his manhood growing apples in the misty orchards of Sussex, far from the warm sun of the Balkans. By the metrics of the Almanac de Gotha, he was a minor figure in a deposed house. But if you view life through the lens of humanity, of peace, purpose, and connection, he was perhaps the most successful royal of the 20th century, while his peers chased the phantom of restoration in the salons of London and Paris. Growing bitter and detached, Tomislav found salvation in the soil. There is a beautiful symmetry in how his story ends. The gardening shears he wielded in England were not a tool of exile. They were the scepter of his true kingdom. He learned that you cannot force a tree to bear fruit by shouting at it, just as you cannot force a nation to love you by decree. You must prune, you must water, you must wait, and above all, you must be present. He applied the patience of a farmer to the volatility of Balkan politics. He understood that nations like orchards have seasons of harsh winter, and he knew that if the roots are deep enough, the spring will eventually come. Today, the wind that blows through the vineyards of Oplenac carries a different scent than the wind that blows through the marble halls of other royal palaces. It does not smell of old wax and dusty velvet. It smells of turned earth, rain, and ripening grapes. It smells of life. When visitors stand before his tomb today, they are not paying respects to a distant historical abstraction. They are visiting the man who kept the lights on. They are visiting the man who proved that dignity is not something you inherit. It is something you cultivate. King Peter II may have been the head of the dynasty, but Tomislav was its hands. And in the end, it was the hands, calloused, dirt-stained, and hard-working, that saved the soul of the family. He showed the world that a crown can be taken away by a revolution, a palace can be seized by a decree, and a title can be erased by a law. But the love for one's native soil, that is the one thing that cannot be confiscated. Tomislav of Yugoslavia returned to the earth twice, once as a farmer and finally as a permanent resident of the crypt. He rests now, not as a tragic exile looking back in anger, but as a gardener who has finished his work, wiped his brow, and finally laid down to sleep in the house he built. The storm is over. The harvest is in. The prince is home.